So good afternoon, everyone. How's your day going so far? Good keynote, good sessions? Yeah, excellent. So last year, I came a day late. I was stranded at O'Hare Airport, and I was convinced that this was some type of a ploy that, you know, the Buckeyes will do anything to keep a Wolverine out of the state, out of Columbus especially, but let alone the state of Ohio. So it is just a gift to be here. For those of you who I haven't had a chance to meet, let me just introduce myself. My name is Kim St. Martin, and my current role, I am the Assistant Director, pre-correct, this is a mouthful, I'm an Assistant Director for Michigan's Integrated Behavior Learning Support Initiative, also known as MyBlissy. So I expect no one to remember that. It even took me a long time, years ago when I was a school participating with MyBlissy, to even figure out how to pronounce it. So I'm currently the Assistant Director with MyBlissy. MyBlissy is our state's MTSS model, a multi-tiered system of support model that focuses on helping schools and districts create an integrated behavior and reading MTSS model. So we focus on positive behavioral intervention supports and layer on scientifically valid reading practices at the elementary and secondary level. I'm also the co-director of our federally funded adolescent reading model demonstration grant. We call that Promoting Adolescent Reading Success, or PARS. And so our emphasis is to work with middle schools who have very at-risk students in the area of reading. Our target population are actually students that have IEP reading goals. And what can we do to accelerate their reading performance in order to kind of close that gap and get them ready to transition into high school, reading at a much more functional level than where they currently are. So prior to my role in the state of Michigan, I am a former teacher. My first year of teaching was actually for the City School District of Philadelphia. Was just a gift. I actually miss Philadelphia. So I was a third grade teacher and working in a very low performing school. And I'm just going to be honest, I came in a week after the school year started. By the time I got my provisional teaching certificate taken care of, I'm an upstate New Yorker. I took over for a teacher who had a mental breakdown because of the class, because of some of the behaviors in the classroom. So my heart has always been with students who need acceleration to really close the gap. So I'm a former administrator as well. So my goal today is really to focus on four things, but I do want to do a little bit of housekeeping. If you go on to the website where all of the Ohio literacy, ODE Literacy Academy materials are, you can download my PowerPoint presentation. If you go to this slide and click on that link, it takes you to a Google folder. And that Google folder is accessible to anyone who has the link. So it's not like those of you who attended this session are the only people who could access it. You may say, ooh, there's a slide or two that my colleagues who aren't here could benefit from. You could have them click on the link and they too will get access to that same file. Okay? I am giving you today a variety of resources that are going to, what I hope to help you prioritize what to do to support your schools post facilitating the Reading Tiered Fidelity Inventory. Okay, so before I get into the outcomes, one of Anita's, Dr. Anita Archer's Archerisms is also not to commit a suicide. And she did not share that one, but I don't want to commit a suicide. But I do want to ask, is it true that everyone here has facilitated, or at least has been a part of administering the Reading Tiered Fidelity Inventory? Okay, if not, I won't put you on the spot, but I'm not going to go into 100% what the RTFI is, how you would administer and score. That was what I did last year, and the need that was expressed by many was to say, okay, now what? We've facilitated the RTFI, our BLTs have RTFI data, where do we go next? So I'm going to focus on the where do we go next. And to help us focus on the where do we go next, I'm going to really hit on these 3 outcomes. I am going to unpack one of the graphics that is central to Ohio's plan to improve literacy, which is, it is a graphic that talks about the supporting infrastructures and the educational practices, the level of emphasis or knowledge needed along what we call the educational cascade. So the educational cascade, if you think of like a stair step, you've got classroom closest to kids, and then you've got grade level, then you have like the BLT level, then you have the district level, you have the regional level, SST, ESC level, all the way up at the ODE level. And so the farther away that you get from kids, the amount of time that needs to be spent on either the supporting infrastructures to improve literacy outcomes or the educational practices shifts. And so I'm going to unpack what that means. The second thing I'm going to get into is go through the building leadership team activities that need to occur post administering the reading tier fidelity inventory. I'm actually going to provide you with 2 full days of what I call installation activities. I'll define that in a little bit. And I've given you an installation checklist of activities that either your elementary buildings or your secondary BLTs could systematically engage in to address those Tier 1 items. Okay? You can also feel free to ask any questions that you want while I'm in the middle of presenting. Before I do begin, do I have any folks in here that are working with me in SST 3 in the Striving Readers Collaborative? Okay, I've got a couple. Okay. You're with SST 3. So I was very fortunate in my last session where I had 2 districts represented. I had Bedford and I had Garfield Heights. And so what was nice is I was able to defer to them as I was sharing some of the activities. They were able to stand up and say, we've done this, and this is the success that we've seen. So if I don't have folks here that can share that information, I will share secondhand information what they said. But I wish I could have bribed one of them to come here. It's always good for you guys to hear from your peers as opposed to me. So let's begin by unpacking that graphic that really anchors your Ohio's plan to improving literacy. It's probably the graphic, outside of the simple view of reading, it is probably the second most important graphic. That's Kim St. Martin's opinion. No one from ODE has said that, but that's just my opinion. This is what it looks like, okay? And so there are two areas of contextual focus. One is the educational practices, and the other is the supporting infrastructure. And depending upon where you are along that educational cascade, classroom level all the way up to the state level, the proportion of time that needs to be spent on each of those contextual areas of focus is different. So the closer to the classroom, most of our time is spent on, is it infrastructure, educational practices? Which one? Educational practices, yep. And as we move up the educational cascade, there is less emphasis on the educational practices and more emphasis on the supporting infrastructures. And so what I oftentimes see, because in the state of Michigan, we have a regional structure similar to Ohio. We have intermediate school districts. They're comparable to your ESCs. And what I oftentimes see are people at the regional level working with providing professional learning, other types of training supports, all the way down to classroom teachers. They come to the ESC, they receive professional learning. What happens is, the unintended consequence of that is it creates a chasm. It creates a chasm that actually prevents high quality use of what got taught to being put into action. And so the issue is that we are not building supporting infrastructures in the areas, the levels of the system in between. So I want to define what we mean by supporting infrastructure and what we mean by educational practices. The reading tiered fidelity inventory is mostly focused on the supporting infrastructure. For those of you who were with me last year, I talked about the RTFI really emphasizing 3 broad areas. Systems was one, data, it was the other, and practices was the third. Data, systems, and practices together improve student outcomes. Now, if you were to treat each of those 3 things as a bucket, you would have lots of rocks in the bucket of systems, because the RTFI heavily emphasizes systems. The other bucket that would have a lot of rocks is in the data. There is lots of emphasis on how you collect data, how you analyze data, how you use data to drive improvements. The bucket that would have the fewest number of rocks in it are around the practices. And the items that focus on practices, and when I say practices, that could broadly mean programs, strategies, like disciplinary literacy strategies, core reading, curriculum resources, intervention materials. The reason why there are so few rocks in that bucket is because the RTFI focuses on what has to be in place to ensure that those things selected are of high quality. They are aligned to specific to scientifically valid reading practices. And so, we do give a nod to educational practices, but the emphasis is mostly on how do you select those things, how do you support the heck out of those things to make sure that the teachers at the classroom level can do what they're expected to do. So I'm going to spend time unpacking the supporting infrastructure, or the systems, because the systems is the bucket that has most of the rocks for the RTFI. So the know-how in the supporting infrastructure is actually anchored to the concepts that are from the National Implementation Research Network. There actually is an organized body that has analyzed the literature and said, what does it take to actually implement things well and sustain the use of those things over time? Is it possible that in our educational careers, there are things that have resurrected that we remember back from like the first couple years of our jobs? Yes or no, everyone? Yeah, but a lot of money goes towards the implementation of evidence-based practices, and unfortunately, not enough time and money is spent on how do you use things well to sustain the use of them over time. Whether it's superintendent turnover, principal turnover, consolidation of buildings, you can fill in the blank. There's a lot of things that cause practices to fall by the wayside, a lot of very legitimate factors. So a lot of the information that talks about how do you create an infrastructure to support things is anchored to those best practices for implementation. Okay? And those things are broadly defined there. Now, I'm going to get into more concrete pieces that would say what are the supporting infrastructures along each of those levels of the cascade. So let's talk about the classroom. This is where the rubber hits the road, true? I mean, teachers, the interactions between teachers and students is where we're going to see the biggest bang for the buck. Anita Archer said the magic is in the instruction. At the same time, though, we have to have a supporting infrastructure so that the instruction, the environment is such where teachers can actually teach and kids can actually learn. So there are some pieces of supporting infrastructure that some know-hows that have to be emphasized at the classroom level. The first one is that teachers at the classroom level have to understand that what has been selected for them to implement, whether it's an assessment, a program, a strategy, that there was a well thought out process that was used to actually come to the decision that these particular resources needed to be used. They need to know that this was not a shiny object that was being chased, that there really was a method to the madness. They also have to know, when the situations warrant, what needs to be deselected to make time and space for them to implement the things that are brand new. So it's not uncommon when I work with schools that the district has gone through a high quality review and selection process. They have selected a new writing curriculum resource, a new reading curriculum resource. But no one has said what needs to be deselected or what should stop being used that would make space for them to use the new things. And so oftentimes from an administrative perspective, my principals, superintendents, other district leaders, some of the biggest resistance that we get is because people don't know how to do what they're being asked to do or don't feel confident or competent to do it, but they also are saying, how does this fit with everything else I have to do? So there needs to be so classroom teachers have to have the knowledge to know what is selected was the result of a high quality process. Here are the things that we should stop using to make space to use these things that have been thoughtfully selected. And then they need to understand what is the continuum of implementation. I mean, how would I, as a kindergarten teacher or a 9th grade teacher, know what the ideal use of this particular strategy or resource is? How would I know what an acceptable variation is? How would I know if I'm not doing it correctly? Now, sometimes in a lot of professional learning that is provided, especially I see this around published materials, whether it's a science, curriculum adoption, ELA adoption, reading textbook adoption, math textbook adoption. We bring in the vendors or the publishers, and they spend like a half a day, and they orient you about how to navigate the teacher materials. But that does not teach the teacher how to actually use the particular components of what was selected to be used. So classroom teachers need to understand that if this is what I'm using, what does ideal implementation look like? What's an acceptable variation? What's an unacceptable variation? Some states that I work with have added a 4th category, which is lethal mutations. Now that just seemed dangerous. I mean, when people said lethal mutations, I thought, holy cow. But lethal mutations are if you implement this in a certain way, you are actually going to see student outcomes go down. You're going to actually do more harm than good when it comes to student outcomes. So that's what classroom teachers need to know around the supporting infrastructure. So now let's juxtapose that to the BLT. So what do BLTs have to know around how to create a supporting infrastructure to ensure that teachers can implement the things that have been intentionally selected? Well, one, the BLT has to know that the district does have and has used a high quality process to select these things. So they too can be confident that what was selected was done so with a good process. They too have to know what is deselected. The other thing they have to know are the stage at which their colleagues are implementing. And this is the piece that is one of the most forgotten pieces of supporting infrastructure. Is it possible that not every teacher in a building is at the same level of has the same level of buy-in as everyone else? Is that possible, yes or no? I mean, you have some people, if you look at the change literature, there really are only about 20% of people within any organization are actually gung-ho and ready and willing to roll up their sleeves and start to make a change. You have a subset of people that are, for lack of a better term, fence sitters. They're open to it, they're willing to learn more about it, but they're not necessarily ready to just roll up their sleeves. And then you have another group of people, it's not even on their radar, okay? And so one of the worst things that we can do to teachers and staff and administrators is treat everyone as if they are at the same level of readiness. So the first stage of implementation is exploration. How are we developing people's readiness? How are we intentionally reviewing and selecting things? How are we intentionally looking at creating space for people to implement what they're being asked to do? Exploration is the first stage of implementation, and there are 4. Now, to give you a concrete example and to give you a window into my sad life, so I forced my husband, when our oldest was ready to learn how to ride his bike, I said we must apply the stages of implementation to figure out how best to take the training wheels off of the bicycle. And he just rolls his eyes. He's accustomed to this, but he rolled his eyes. So exploration is the first stage, and in that case, I did my research. I had to Google, I don't remember what it was like for me when I was 4 and had the training wheels taken off my bike. So I said, what are the best ways, what are my options that we would want to select from? And there were really 2. It was the take one training wheel off, and then you wobble, kid gets used to wobbling, take the other one off, mom, dad, guardian, grandma, someone runs behind the bike, stabilizing the bike. So that was option A. Option B was like immersion. Take the training wheels off and let the kid figure it out, okay? We went with option A. We went with that. So I explored, we selected, and it was option A. And now I had to get my husband ready because I do not like to sweat or exercise, and so I was not going to run behind that bike. And so I had to develop his readiness to be able to handle all of the steps of implementing. That is exploration. Think of it from a school example. You're selecting curriculum resource materials. You're exploring the options out there. You've selected something, but now you're developing people's readiness to understand why. Why do we need this? How does this change impact me? So the second stage, installation. How many of you have seen The Wizard of Oz? It's an oldie, but a goodie, yeah. So think of that famous scene where Toto is pulling the curtain, and the wizard says, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Installation is all behind the scenes. Installation are things like professional learning, things like ordering of the materials or the resources, making a plan for how, people who didn't get initially trained, how will they receive professional learning? People who did receive professional learning but need more knowledge, skills, and abilities, how do we retrain them? People who need coaching supports, how do we coach them? So there are very specific things in this installation stage that have to take place. I can tell you that when it comes to the bike riding analogy, installation looked like this. I knew Logan was gonna wobble and fall, so we had Band-Aids. I made sure we had the Neosporin. I made sure the bicycle helmet fit correctly, because if he fell on the concrete, I didn't want a concussion. I made sure that we had some ways to motivate him to get back on the bicycle, because Logan's the type of kid that if he couldn't do something right, or if he was going to result in injury, he wouldn't want to do it at all. So now, if you were to walk up to Logan and say, do you have any idea that your parents are about to rock your world and take your training wheels off? Logan would say no, because it was all behind the scenes. Same thing with an educational example. If you were to walk up to students in installation and say, do you have any idea that we are about to select and deselect writing curriculum resource materials? They would look at you like you're crazy, because they have no idea. It's all behind the scenes. Okay? So that is the second stage of implementation. You're still developing readiness at this point, because as people start to learn how to use what they're being asked to do, you still at that point have consensus readiness issues to deal with. Some people may find it hard and start to say, whoa, I want to go back to doing what we were doing. It was much easier. I felt more confident and competent in being able to do it. So from a leadership level, the district level and building level, we have to make sure that we are still remembering readiness and buy-in, even in that second stage of implementation, okay? The third stage that BLTs need to understand is initial implementation. So initial implementation is that we have just started to engage and use what we were taught to do. I can tell you that this is where selective abandonment occurs, because implementation, as a matter of fact, in the national literature, initial implementation is referred to as the, quote, messy, awkward stage. And the goal is to survive the messy, awkward stage, because most people do not like to struggle and when they are starting to use something, especially when we feel like we're struggling in front of the kids that we are responsible for teaching. That's a whole different layer of complexity. So initial implementation is typically when selective abandonment of things that are being selected occurs. So any good BLT, and I could take this up to the district level, which you're going to see what the district level has to do to support in a minute, any good BLT has to understand this is the stage in which our staff are implementing, and here are some activities that we have to be very mindful to do, because we have to respect where they are in that implementation process. The final stage is full implementation. So full implementation, you have survived the messy and awkward stage. You are now, like, you got it going on. You are implementing things the way that they needed to be done. Now, to use the bike analogy, the difference between initial implementation and riding a bike is that you're doing everything by the book. You both hands on the handlebars, making sure that you're going at a certain speed, using the brake just well. Full implementation is you've got a routine, and now you can kind of ease up. You're not as nervous. It feels more comfortable. You can start to take one hand off the handlebar. I mean, think about it. As we learn something, the first time we do something is a lot more challenging than after we've developed some automaticity, some fluency, and are able to actually do it. So I want you to think about where you currently are working or a previous job experience. Think about those 4 stages: exploration, installation, initial implementation, and full implementation. Where do you think in your whatever your experience you're thinking of, which stage was missed? Which stage was overlooked? Okay? Go ahead and talk for a few moments to either your elbow partner or your table mates, and we'll come back together. Yeah.
But we need to converse
Okay.
about where you want us to go next, because we'll have one more
Sure.
meeting after.
Sure.
And then are you going back next year?
Coming back next year.
Are you doing more of this next year with this group?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. You have to tell me. We do have to go to intervention system, don't we?
What we think you
We have to go beyond tier 1. So yeah. Okay, let me bring you back together. May I have your attention, please? All right. So I'm curious, how many people said either exploration or installation is an overlooked stage? How many folks said that? Yes, head nods? Okay, yep. And there is absolute research to support you in that. Oftentimes people they pick something and then it's like, okay, now go do it. Or we've done like a spray and pray PD where I've given you lots of information. Let's pray that it now gets implemented. And I'll tell you from a former administrative perspective, the hardest thing for a leader to deal with are people who just don't have the buy-in of what it is that we're doing. And even harder for an administrator, just to give a plug to supporting school leaders, is that I, as a school leader, would not feel comfortable having to answer these really tough questions if my level of knowledge is only about one step or two steps ahead of the rest of my staff. Now, I will tell you, for staff who are, for lack of a better term, resistant or perhaps reluctant to implement what they're being asked to implement, some folks can actually see that the principal cannot answer a question, and it's almost like it's viewed as like a crack in the armor. And I have had teachers that have just seized that moment and honed in on asking really tough questions that they know the administrators haven't had the opportunity to have access to information to be able to answer it. And so in the installation stage, school leaders would be having their knowledge simultaneously built so that they can feel more effective in moving staff through that readiness phase. The other things that BLTs need to know is they also, a supporting infrastructure at the school level is also around communication. So it is very important for the BLT to understand who are the other groups and teams, grade levels being one teaming structure, but who are the other groups and teams in the school whose work is starting to touch on some of the reading components of an MTSS model. A good example, or just MTSS in general. A good example is I work with a lot of schools who already have PBIS up and running, Positive Behavioral and Intervention Supports. And there may be a PBIS team that is in the school. But now the BLT is working on the reading components of an MTSS model. But the PBIS team maybe has planned staff meeting time. They've got other professional learning topics and data sharing pieces that they want to do. And so it is important to communicate and coordinate work with that team, because what we don't want our staff seeing these things as separate pieces of information. You're going to hear me talk in a little bit about how when you think about academics or behavior within a multi-tiered system of support, which do you address first? And that is really a chicken and egg question. It's very hard to say which comes first. Do you address the social, emotional, behavioral needs, or do you address the academics? Because they really do go hand in hand, okay? With communication, links right to burial. We're not killing people and burying them. Barrier removal process. So tomorrow, if you are with me in my session on barriers impeding implementation, I'm going to start with what a district's barrier removal process looks like. How would a district outline steps to be able to identify and remove barriers impeding implementation? And this process is generalizable across content areas, not just in reading, but regardless of what the barrier is. But you can't have a good barrier removal process if there isn't a mechanism to communicate. I mean, communication is the key to identify and help people address those barriers. The last two supporting infrastructures that school teams need to know, they need to understand data. They need to understand a slice of data that is aggregating student outcomes across the school. They don't need to be looking at individual teacher data, nor should they. They don't need to be looking at students' individual progress monitoring data. They do need to be able to look across the school, across grade levels, and say, given these critical reading skills, which have been outlined in the simple view of reading, do we have goes-upness? Are we seeing improvements across grade levels? Where are there areas of success? Where are there areas of need? A non-example of data analysis at a school level is I've seen schools try to engage in data analysis for each grade level without the grade level teachers at the table. And that just defeats the purpose. We want grade levels analyzing their specific class, like their aggregated grade level data, and we want them to know how to prioritize that data and use it to make instructional adjustments. So there is a slice of data analysis at the BLT level that needs to happen with this work. The last supporting infrastructure piece that BLTs have to focus on are competency supports. So what supports may exist for their colleagues in the school who may need retraining, or you may have a new teacher that that needs initial training because they were new to just hired. So this BLT needs to know who would we want to access, or who should we advocate to our district that gets access to provide staff with the knowledge, skills, and abilities to do what they're asked to do? How do we give them coaching supports if needed as well? So the BLT has to understand what competency supports are available. That is why the RTFI has items around systems coaching, instructional coaching. Those are competency supports. The RTFI Tier 1 item has, there's an item around access to professional learning, around connecting professional learning needs to the school-wide reading plan. That is another example of competency supports. So these are the supporting infrastructures. And like I said, the RTFI, heavy, heavy, heavy on supporting infrastructures and heavy at the BLT level. I'm going to give a nod to the district level. They need to understand implementation stages too, because they are the people who dictate or drive the exploration process and the ability to take time to focus on installation and the ability to take time to focus on those initial implementation stage-based activities versus full implementation. They have to know if what has been selected is made usable, teachable, learnable, doable, and readily assessed in practice. So something may look great, but there's no real good content out there to teach people how to do it. So that would be a non-example of usable, okay? Because we have no confidence that there are training materials out there that can actually teach people to do this. So teachable, learnable, we have evidence that if those materials are used, people can learn to do what they're being asked to do. Usable or doable is that we have evidence that if they're taught, they are actually implementing. They're actually using those things as intended. And readily assessed in practice is like a Fidelity, a way to say, is it happening? Is it not happening? How would we know? Districts have to think through those things. They also have to have a mechanism to address competency needs. They're the people that allocate the resources. So building administrators sometimes have a small budget, perhaps that they can allocate to send staff to certain things, but I've seen that that's not the case. Matter of fact, that is more and more not the case in the districts that I'm working. So the district has to, the communication flow up to the district has to be, we have competency issues. We have people who don't feel confident and competent in doing what they're being asked to do. So there has to be a way to leverage the resources to get them what they need, and communication protocols for the purpose of identifying what's going well, and then how do we identify barriers and remove those barriers. The district, too, has to also understand data analysis. That in and of itself is a supporting infrastructure, okay? So that is the level of knowledge in the supporting infrastructure. The RTFI hits really hard on the supporting infrastructure at the school and grade level, okay? There is also a couple of items that talk about the supporting infrastructure at the district level. The district has a process to select core reading curriculum materials, has a process to select intervention materials, has a process to select and deselect those things as well, and select and deselect assessments. Those are the items of the RTFI that get at the supporting infrastructure at the district level. And also the district provides guidelines for how to use the intervention and reading materials. You heard Anita's mantra, teach the stuff and cut the what? Teach the stuff, cut the fluff. And you heard Anita say there's a lot of fluff in curriculum materials. So teachers need to understand what are the need to do's, what are the nice to do's, what are the resources that we need to use, what are those things that we can just kind of ignore. And so that is a supporting infrastructure piece right from the RTFI that gives a nod to helping teachers navigate the sheer volume of resources that come in the things that have been purchased. For educational practices, this is where the rubber hits the road. So there are different levels of knowledge needed, and most knowledge, the highest level of knowledge around the educational practices is at the classroom level, because this is where the rubber hits the road. The teachers who are at the classroom level have to know so much more about the ins and outs of what they're being asked to implement. And so the knowledge that is heaviest in the educational practices is at the classroom level. So here is what they need to know. So here are the components of what has been selected, the need to do's. Here are the core components, okay? Here's what they are, here's what they're not. Here's how you use these components with diverse learners, whether it's students that are at or above grade level or students with disabilities, okay? Here's how Fidelity is going to be measured. We shouldn't keep that a secret from teachers, because many teachers say, gosh, I wish I had that right away. That would have been great. It could have helped the teacher understand, here's what it looks like in action versus not. And they also have to know how to collect and analyze data to inform their instruction. So that, even though there's only 4 bullets, those 4 bullets pack a powerful punch. At the school level, this is what we need to know. Now this is a great example. BLTs, you could have, if you're elementary folks, you could have a 5th grade teacher who does not need to know the ins and outs of the phonemic awareness curriculum that the K-1 teachers are using. But they do have to know that here are the critical skills that we're focusing on. Here's some new curriculum resources that are being used, and we should expect certain data to improve. See, it's a different level of knowledge versus a K-1 teacher who's sitting on that team as well, who's like, oh yeah, I'm implementing that every day. Different levels of knowledge at that level. They have to know how Fidelity is going to be measured. They have to know how to analyze and aggregate student outcome data. They have to know the impact on resources. So this group has to keep a pulse on what is the school already committing to doing, allocating staff meeting time, PLC time for grade level meetings, any type of building level specific PD time that's allocated. They have to know what's vying for that time and where are our staff being assigned to support. True story, when I was a building administrator, we had to pull some paraeducators who were supporting interventions. They were trained and coached, so I want to put that out there, that we just didn't have anyone providing intervention support. But we had to prioritize our staff based on where the data suggested it was a need. My BLT had to have a good pulse with me as the leader, had to understand where are we currently allocating our resources and at what grade levels. So if the data were suggesting a need, we had to start trying to shift those resources. Now, ultimately, me as the leader, I was the person that had to communicate that. I did not want the BLT to look like they were responsible for having a 4th grade teacher's, a grade levels para-educator removed. But we really were helping to figure out, based on the need, how can we shift support to address the need. The principals, they have to know the look-fors at this level. Principals are on these BLTs. They have to know what implementation looks like and doesn't look like and need to be in classrooms actually seeing if it's happening. District level practice knowledge, the district has to know how to operationalize what was implemented. So a non-example of that is the district saying, we've selected X, Y, or Z, we've got a trainer coming, and the memo goes out that everyone's going to implement it starting the first day of school. That is a non-example of how to operationalize something. And I know that seems like an extreme example, but you'd be surprised in some of the states that I've been in, that still does happen. I'm saying that not to cast a broad net. I'm not saying everyone does that, but there are still places that do that. They have to understand what the essential components are. Here are the need to-dos. They have to know what Fidelity assessment is going to be used, and they have to know what type of student outcome data is going to be collected and analyzed to determine areas of strength and areas of need. Okay? So I want you to think back to these slides. We unpack the supporting infrastructure, and then we unpack the educational practice know-how. So given your role in what you're supporting, okay, where are some areas of strength that you see in your school or regions? What are some opportunities? Based on the information presented, you're thinking, ooh, we do that well, or ooh, this is an opportunity for us to grow in this area. Go ahead and think about those things, talk about those things, and we'll come back together. How about you guys? Okay, we're going to come back together. May I have your attention, please? So, so a lot of folks were talking about, I had a great conversation about district who is selected, like Ready Gen as a core reading program. There's just a lot of pieces. I mean, think about a core reading program that has science extension activities, social studies extension activities. Those things are not the need to do's relative to the foundational reading skills, like things like phonemic awareness, phonics and word recognition, connecting that to fluency. So there are specific manipulatives that teachers have, like sound spelling cards. Those are really important to be used as you're introducing the letters and the sounds. So unfortunately, teachers aren't given the guidance. And if you have a really good teacher who's taught the grade level, very familiar with his or her curriculum standards, they tend to know what should be selected, but not everyone's like that. I had a PE teacher at the high school level who was teaching kindergarten. Because of bumping rules, this gentleman was in kindergarten because he had an early childhood endorsement, but had never taught kindergarten. And so he was the type of teacher that I had to amp up the supports for: training, retraining, coaching supports, okay? So the need to do's versus the nice to do's versus the don't even waste your time using, okay? That's what we're talking about. So what we're moving into now is a section on installation. So I have given you guys in that Google folder, that's the second slide of the presentation. If you click on the link, you're taken right to a folder. There are 2 documents that are in that folder that are called elementary installation checklist and secondary installation checklist. I have given you the exact checklist that our school teams, our BLTs use as they go through a scope and sequence of professional learning. Now, I could not in good conscience separate the behavior from the reading. And the reason why is because it truly is the ultimate chicken and egg question. Which do you address? Do you address behavioral issues first, or do you address the academic issues? And so here's a good example of that. Think of kids at the secondary level. Where are my secondary teachers? Okay, I've got a couple in here. So you have some kids that may be in 9th grade, 8th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade. They may have been struggling readers since 1st grade. And so many kids, it's human nature that we as humans do not like to do something that we have a low perceived probability of success. And so we typically, as adults, try to avoid those things. I am not good at sports. I'm not offering my time to go out and participate on a sports team. Okay? I want to avoid. I am horrible at statistics. And I had to sit on a conference call on Thursday with someone walking me through a bunch of statistics, and I was literally looking for ways to get off of the phone. I wanted to escape and avoid that conversation. Our secondary kids do that too. Our elementary kids do that. Now at the secondary level, here's how it looks. Have you ever seen the kids put up their hoods, pretend to be lethargic and fall asleep in class? Sometimes they're tired, don't get me wrong. But I've seen kids who are conveniently tired anytime they have to go to intervention class. So like I said, we're working with middle school kids who are the kids who need the most acceleration in reading outcomes. Some of those kids will put up the hood, they will pretend to fall asleep. Some of them actually do make themselves fall asleep. They will blurt out, try to get the teacher to kick them out of class, throw spit wads, laugh anytime a peer answers a question correctly. And so these are kids who unfortunately will do anything to escape and avoid instruction. And so their behavior could be the purpose, the reason why they are, why they may be kicked out of class or why they may be sent to the principal's office. Now, flip that around. You have some kids who maybe, bless you, who are starting the year, who start kindergarten with doing really well academically, but then their behaviors are getting in the way and they are being kicked out of the class, sent to the office, suspended from school. They don't access instruction. So their behavior contributed to them having academic difficulties because they're not accessing instruction. So you can't separate the academic supports from the behavioral supports. That is why the Reading Tier Fidelity Inventory has items in Tier 1 that get at classroom procedures and routines. Because remember, in the framework of addressing practices and supports, even at the classroom level, while most of it is knowledge of the educational practices, there is still a piece that is around the supporting infrastructure. They have to know how to structure their environment to ensure that they can teach and the kids can actually learn. And they know how to deal with mild but frequent misbehaviors so that it's not compromising the learning from their peers. And at the Tier 2, Tier 3 level, we integrate the individualized problem-solving team should have people with reading expertise at the table or math expertise, the student struggling in math. You must have behavioral expertise as well. Because for many of those kids, their academic intervention plan might really need a behavioral component to motivate the kids to want to engage in the intervention because they have a low perceived probability of success. So the installation checklist that you guys have include what gets installed for positive behavior intervention supports and what gets installed around the Tier 1 reading components. I did not include the Tier 2, Tier 3 installation pieces. Here's why. There is a lot of need in Tier 1. And if we're not being systematic in addressing Tier 1, we are going to, bless you, we are going to bleed out. I mean, it's the equivalent to if you have a dam and there's a lot of issues, structural issues with the dam. And you've got, like you're trying to plug the cracks of the dam, right, with different things. If we don't get behind and deal with the infrastructure, like what is causing the dam to leak, you are going to continue to exert too many resources to fixing cracks here and there. We have a lot of kids who, yes, do need support, but if we don't create a classroom structure and help support the use of scientifically valid practices at the Tier 1 level, we're going to continue to exert too many resources to remediate. It's going to be too reactive. So I absolutely can put an installation checklist in there to address the Tier 2, Tier 3 components, but it was not where people typically need to start. We don't encourage people to skip Tier 1 and go to Tier 2, Tier 3. People are discouraged to do that. So the installation checklist that you have are addressing that portion of the framework. It's kind of grade level, school level, okay? And they look like this. You have one for elementary, one for secondary. And then you also, you could certainly access our state website. All of our professional learning materials are on the website, free for download. And I've given you some that I'm specifically using with SST3 with schools that we're putting through like an installation series to address the Tier 1 items of the RTFI. So here is what would need to be installed if you focus on Tier 1. So building leadership team. Now, some people say, what are you doing with the building leadership team? But is it possible that perhaps we've all sat on an ineffective team? Is that possible, yes or no? Yes, yes. And so while it may seem obvious how to structure up a team for success, it is not, I don't see it, sadly, I don't see it in reality. I mean, I see really ineffective teams. And so some of the materials that you have really even go back to school committee audits at the building. So working with school administrators to say, what teams do you have in your school? And oftentimes schools have a lot of teams, more teams than they actually need. And so it's a good opportunity for the building administrator to take stock of who the people are that are supporting different areas of the work. Are there teams that could be eliminated because their purpose has been already achieved? Are there teams that have similar purposes that could be combined? You can also, the school committee audit that I've had people do, lists who the people are, so you can start to see, are the same people on every team, okay? So that is something here. The daily reading instruction, an audit of what is being used to teach reading across every grade level, and how is it being used? How often is it being used? This is taking stock of what's being used to provide reading instruction across grade levels. And in a few minutes, I'm gonna ask Colleen and Margaret, who are coaching these schools in Region 3, who are Striving Reader Grant recipients, to talk about some of the learning. But let me give a nod to secondary, for my secondary people who are here. So I do not want to cast a broad net. This doesn't always happen, but it oftentimes happens. So I've had secondary principals who will come up to me and pull me aside and say, you asked me if I have a BLT. I do, but I have an A team and a B team. And I'm like, well, tell me more about this A team and this B team. And they say, well, so the A team are typically my department heads who needed to be on my team because they're getting Schedule B pay because they are department heads. But they're not the people who I really lean on to implement this work. But they have to be on this team. And so I've had administrators say, I need to call this team something different. And it's like the B team who is these people are gonna roll up their sleeves and do this work. I've seen that a lot at the secondary level. I haven't seen it as often at the elementary level. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist, I just haven't seen it as often. So for the secondary, we also talk about a content area reading strategy focus. We frame it around comprehension though. I think the biggest mistake people made in the MTSS field is we led secondary teachers to believe that they had to be reading experts. They had to be experts at teaching reading. So for those of you who are secondary administrators or teachers, think about the coursework that these people you had in college. It's more around your core subject area. It wasn't in how to teach reading. And so we, unfortunately, within the RTI MTSS field, I think contributed to some of the, what I would describe as resistance to engaging in addressing the reading components of an MTSS model. So we've flipped the switch a bit within our state, and we're framing everything around comprehension. That it doesn't matter if kids are reading text in my science class or ELA class or math class or social studies class. There are things I have to do before they read to make sure they're understanding or comprehending. There's things I have to do while they are reading and things I have to do after they've read. Even if they're not using text, I view it from a listening comprehension standpoint. There are things I can do before I start teaching them what it is that I intend to teach. There's things I can do while I'm teaching to see if there's misunderstandings. And there's things I can do after I've taught to see if they've understood or comprehended what I taught. So by framing it around comprehension, the anxiety of teaching reading has been diffused. Because any teacher should want kids to understand what they're teaching, whether it's through listening comprehension or reading comprehension. So I just want to be very, very frank in saying that. I think some of the issues at the secondary level have been, for those of us who work in the MTSS field, I think that we've contributed to some of the potential buy-in issues at secondary. So here is the timeline. In your Google folder, you have a folder that is installation day 1. That folder includes resources to address these particular things. There is a packet entitled, setting the BLT up for success. It gets at things like primary facilitator, secondary facilitator. I mean, I've seen so many teams, if the facilitator is out for the day, the meeting gets canceled. Okay? But we could still meet if we have a secondary person who's been identified. You're the backup person. So you've got documents to help with that. That document also includes ways to develop communication protocols, how to identify the groups and teams that a BLT needs to systematically communicate with to now address the reading components of an MTSS model. School-wide reading plan, I think I've put in there a template for developing that plan. And we have audits as well. You have 2 Google spreadsheets that get at the audit of core reading materials for elementary and content area reading materials for secondary. Okay? Day 2 is going to include these pieces. So we're going to pick up where we left off, and we're going to now help them act on their audit. We are going to give folks who are there an example of a district process to review, select, and deselect things. We're going to introduce an assessment system. So how our data, so all of those assessment items in the RTFI that get at individuals to coordinate the assessments, to train people on how to administer and score and interpret the data, those things are documented in the assessment system. You have a template that will help outline those things. I am actually with Margaret and Colleen April 5th, right, ladies? April 5th. And the timing was off because of the freeze. Remember, it was like 50 below zero. I was supposed to be here in February, where we would have looked at winter screening data. So that has been adjusted, where we will look at spring screening data and address the final piece in the day 3. And you can see what we're doing in the 3rd day as well. Okay? So I want to defer to Colleen and Margaret to talk a little bit about what their teams have done who have gone through installation day 1. So it's this slide right here. So could you ladies share? And I'll pull up the audits too so people could see.
Hello, everybody. My name's Colleen Longo, and this is Margaret Watson. We're SST Region 3, Region Early Literacy Specialists. So as Kim said, we have been working with her with our Striving Readers districts, and our participants have completed, first of all, looking at their BLT startup, and Kim mentioned that, and I just want to concur with what Kim said, that when we brought the teams together, every single team said that they had a up and running BLT. And when we encouraged them to really take a serious look at the team and look at the processes and see if they had all of the pieces and parts in place, they realized that they didn't. And so that was a starting point for a lot of people, going back and really looking at, first of all, who's on the BLT. Is it representational of your stakeholder groups, and are the right people on the bus? And then what are the processes and procedures that you have in place about your for your protocols, your meeting, something as simple as having a meeting schedule for the year. Lots of people did not have that. They were only creating meetings as they came up. So people really spent a good deal of time this fall getting those processes in place, and then our job has been to keep reminding them to use them. Just because you have them in place, sometimes they still don't make it into practice. So they were doing that, and that's been moved along really well. Then the other thing that came out of that discussion around the BLT was the realization that, as Kim said, there's all these different teams, and none of the teams communicate with each other. So the development of the communication plans between teams was a really big process and piece of the work, and really helped to streamline what information the BLT was going to give to other teams, and what information the BLT wanted to receive from other teams. And when Kim presented this to our Striving Readers districts, and Margaret and I were the follow-up coaching them through the work, some people really didn't want to do this. And then when they sat down and did it, they realized how effective it was. So they didn't think they needed a communication protocol between the different teams. And it wasn't until they actually did it that they've reported back now how it has really helped facilitate the communication and make sure everybody knows what each other is doing. Then probably the most exciting piece was the reading audit. And so we have a variety of districts. Some people did the reading audit K to 12, so they did the entire school. Other people, if they felt that they couldn't conduct it K to 12, only did the elementary, or they did a secondary audit with the intention that they would eventually do the entire K to 12. And it was very thoughtfully prepared. So how are they going to involve the teachers? How are they going to get the maximum number of voices heard in collecting the information about the audit? And then once they gathered all the information, people did it in lots of different ways. And then part of our job in our network was to share the different ways people were doing it so that they could learn from each other and see what worked. And then was coming together and analyzing the audit. And I think in the analysis of the audit, that was the biggest aha for people. I think, I can't say this with 100% certainty, but most of the districts, I think, would share that they found out that there was a lot of divergency going on in what was happening in reading across the curriculum. And even though they knew that, it was seeing it in print and seeing how much had drifted over time away from programs, or pieces and parts that were brought in, nothing ever deselected. So it really created a very clear entry point for what do we have to do to start creating this reading plan. What do we want to get rid of? What are we going to take with us into the future, and where are the gaps? And I think that really the best part of the audit was really helping to explicitly lay out where the gaps were in the instruction.
Yeah. At the secondary level, I pulled up this one. So, remember, I intentionally framed it around comprehension. And so the guidance around before reading comprehension strategies, during reading comprehension strategies, after reading comprehension strategies, is actually coming from Anita Archer. So when Anita was giving the Michigan example of text summarization, she is on our adolescent reading team. She's a part of our national group that has provided the initial professional learning to the teachers in the middle school that we are supporting. And text summarization using writing frames is one of the strategies that we have taught all the core subject area teachers at the secondary level of where we're learning. So for two reasons. One is summarization is a very research-supported comprehension practice. Getting kids to summarize what they read actually has evidence to show that kids are moving information from short-term memory into long-term memory. The issue, though, is that some kids don't know what to extract from what they read and don't know even how to structure a summary. Writing is a huge issue across our country. We have a lot of kids at the middle and high school level that are writing, they're speaking in sentence fragments, and they're writing in a very fragmented way. And so, text summarization using writing frames is a temporary scaffold that helps kids know what to go into in the text that they've read to extract, to do either like a compare and contrast, character analysis if you're an ELA teacher, a summarization if you're doing informational text or a narrative, even things like an analysis of a graphic. Think about in science how important the graphics are in science text. They carry a lot of meaning. Kids need to know how to look at a graphic and be able to analyze the information, because that is going to improve their understanding of the content that they're being taught. And so text summarization using a writing frame, it's an after reading strategy, but it is a way to help them know what to focus on, to extract, and then how to write up a high quality piece of writing. And it actually has some evidence to show that if we have kids writing more, and I'm not talking about really long pieces of writing, it is short writing more often, long writing more seldom, but short writing more often actually improves their writing skills. And so that's just one example of a reading strategy that we use across all of the core subject area classes, and we frame them around comprehension. Explicit vocabulary instruction, I think you're going to see, some of you maybe have already seen or will see Anita Archer do a session on that. That is a good before reading strategy. We also use, it's an oldie but a goodie, SQ3R, right? Survey, question, read, recite, review. Now, what people forget, I've had some folks say, well, that is a babyish strategy. Actually, no. SQ3R was originally designed for college freshmen. That was, if you go back into the genealogy of that strategy, it was written for college freshmen because that was the first time that they were going to be expected to have to be much more independent in their educational career. And so kids needed to know kids needed to learn that headings and subheadings mean something. And if you are going to survey what your headings and subheadings, that is going to help give you a schema of what it is that you're going to be reading about. So SQ3R includes elements of before reading and during reading and after reading comprehension strategy instruction. And there's others. I mean, I'm just giving you a few examples. But the big idea is that we should try to identify a key group of strategies that we're using at the middle school and high school level to enhance students' comprehension. And we should try to consistently use the strategy. By keeping the strategy constant, it allows your lowest performing students to free up more cognitive energy to learn the content that you're teaching. As opposed to when I go to Mr. or Miss So-and-so's class, they teach vocab using this strategy. Now I have to flip the switch. And when I go to Mr. So-and-so's science class, he uses a different strategy. And so when you do that to your lowest performing kids, it causes them to almost divide their cognitive energy to knowing the strategy that you want them to use and the content that you want them to learn. If we can keep the strategy constant, it frees up more cognitive energy for them to be able to learn the information. So this is why we want to audit what's being used, because across departments, we should have a core group of strategies that are being used that are relevant to the content that we're teaching. Yes, question?
So when you say audit and when you did this with your team, and I could have missed this because there's a lot going in my brain going on right now, what is considered audit? Is it, hey, sixth grade teacher, do you do this? Or, hey, I know that this is, closed reading strategy, I see this in practice, there's evidence of it.
It was not, hey, fifth grade teacher, do you do this? It was much more where people asked, Kim, can you go back to the elementary audit?
I will. Yep.
Are you interested in any of them or second?
Whatever.
So each of these questions was part of the audit, and then people created different ways to collect the evidence. So some districts worked in teams, so like every teacher in kindergarten met together on a morning and filled out the audit for their team, answering what they did specifically, and then the district had to then come together and look at all of the materials across the board. They did not just hand it to people to sit in isolation and fill it out, so that there was some consistency and conversation around what did it really look like. If we say we did this, does it mean we do it every day? Does it mean we do it most of the time? So it was, there was a lot of attempts at making it specific. But because there was so much variance in what we found, that there was a lot of differences in answers. At the secondary level, there were all kinds of strategies used all over the place. probably the most consistent thing we found is that there wasn't any consistency across
Yeah.
any of
That's true.
the places where the strategies were used.
So based off of their responses, you were able to tell like, oh, they don't really know what close reading is in comparison, you know, as opposed to trying to dig deep to make sure everyone understood the thing, their responses.
Yes,
told them.
and even I sat in and just observed in a secondary, when the district was doing a secondary audit, and people didn't, there was just a huge variation in what people even considered it a reading strategy.
That's
Yeah,
what I was-
very, very different, and and then those conversations, but even that was extremely instructive in the sense that you really started to get a sense of what people knew and where there might be good places to begin instruction and PD and how to select strategies, that type of thing. But yeah, it was very, very, very.
Tracy? Yes, yeah. Yeah, so, you know, so here's kind of like the elephant in the room, is that even though the RTFI focuses mostly on systems and data analysis and use, right? So, but really heavy on the systems, you should develop a system around good stuff, right? So these questions are going to start to unpack what is the quality of the things that are being used that we put in the hands of teachers? Do they align or not with scientifically valid practices to support reading? Tomorrow, I'm doing a session on barriers for implementation. The number one barrier is actually lack of knowledge in what constitutes scientifically valid reading practices. And so I always say to folks, you know, yes, develop systems. I mean, I love the quote from Mike Schmoker. It's on page 2. You place a good person in a bad system, the system wins every time. Because that is true. I mean, I'm an advocate for teachers and teachers first. And so you place a good person in a bad system, the system wins every time. But I've seen people develop really organized systems, really tight systems. But it's around, frankly, garbage. It's around stuff that has no empirical evidence to improve outcomes. So all you have is really well-organized crap. I mean, I'm just being honest. It's true. Let's call a spade a spade. So if we don't get at what's being used, then we don't know to what extent we're creating a structure around stuff that warrants to be organized really well. I have a school that is using, for their core reading program, they were using Pinterest. Now, I'm not criticizing Pinterest. I find really great hairstyles and things on Pinterest, okay? But when it comes to using Pinterest to educate our kids, that could be a problem, right? That could just saying, that could be a problem. So we have to be very careful about knowing what's being used. Yes? Yes. So if you go in, yep, I'm going to go back into your Google folder. So hang on. So if you go to installation, so it is the installation day 1 folder, okay? And you see the elementary audit here, daily reading audit elementary, and core subject area comprehension audit. Okay, so you see them in there. Yes?
Questions. One, after doing the audit, what if what you find that we're doing really has no research base, that we really created a bunch of things that have no empirical evidence?
So that is day 2. Whew. And day 2, if you go into day 2, I actually am providing an example of a district review and selection process. And this is the template that we give to district teams in our state who go through a multi-day professional learning series. Module 8 is when they learn how to develop this. And it goes through very specific questions, like when is this process used, who actually initiates it, how are decisions made on things that are reviewed and selected, and here's the directions for it. But this document goes into like very key questions that should be asked. And then I've included some supporting resources that are specific to people looking to select Tier 1 core reading curriculum resources. You'll see the core reading curriculum review process that talks about how do you form a team, So it's kind of like beginning the process, using the process, and then it's like what you do at the end. And I also, tied to what you just heard Anita do, I have included the elements of explicit instruction because we want to make sure that whatever is selected, it is harder to write very explicit teaching instructional routines. And so I always want people to select things to make sure that there are explicit instructional routines in there. It's a whole heck of a lot easier to take kids that have high levels of background knowledge, history of success, and extend their learning. It's easier to do that than it is to have a teacher write more explicit teaching routines. So these are some additional resources that we provide to districts to use with their review and selection process if you're applying it to reading curriculum materials or even like intervention materials as well. Okay, does that answer? Yes.
Question was, can you kind of, in a nutshell, give us what is the shift between kind of what we were studying 15 or so years ago with content literacy strategist Janet Allen and so forth, to now what we're seeing kind of with like really Cassett, what she's saying with disciplinary literacy? It seems like I feel as I read here of late, there's these undertones that we were throwing out a bunch of strategies back 15 years ago and just throwing them at teachers when really there's specific ones we should have had our eye on for science versus social studies versus math.
Yeah, so the question was the distinction between content area reading versus disciplinary literacy. I'm going to be honest, in our state, we don't have that debate. When you look at the research that supports comprehension, because that's the goal, right? I don't care what content area you're teaching, the goal is comprehension. And so summarization has a lot of evidence behind it. Now, I will admit, what you're using, how you're summarizing a piece of literature is very different than if you're doing like cause and effect in a social studies textbook, or if you were summarizing a graphic in a science textbook that you are analyzing. So I do believe that you can use strategies like summarization, but depending upon the discipline or the core subject area that you're applying it, it should look different based on the text that you have and what you're teaching. But vocabulary, there's so much evidence to support teaching of vocabulary as a before reading strategy to improve kids' knowledge or their understanding of what it is that they're reading. But how I'm teaching vocabulary, what I'm teaching and how I'm teaching it, what I'm teaching looks different depending upon the discipline, the core subject area. But I could use a very consistent instructional routine that it doesn't matter if I'm using it in math or science or social studies. And I can share some examples of vocabulary resources that are being created by science teachers, social studies teachers, ELA teachers. They have a lot in literary elements, rising, falling action, the climax, foreshadowing. But the common thread is we're going to teach vocabulary and we're using a very explicit instructional routine. So a lot of what I've read about some of the conflicts of content area reading is that some people are throwing out things like KWL as like a content area reading strategy. I've never been a fan of KWL, not the K, because if you ask kids what they know, you have immediately separated the haves from the have-nots. You have kids that perhaps do not have sufficient background knowledge, and you ask them what they know, and they're likely to give you misinformation. So every time a student gives you misinformation or practices the wrong way, it takes up to 12 times for them to have to do it the right way to undo the learning. So I am just going to be honest. I feel like, to me, I don't see an issue with disciplinary literacy or content area reading. I believe that these strategies should and could look differently based on what I'm using in my core subject area class. I mean, just being honest. I don't know if that makes sense in terms of what you heard, but I always go back to where is the evidence around comprehension, and there are some things that have lots of evidence. Yeah, I don't know if that helps. Any other questions or thoughts before we leave? Okay, well, if you think of anything, please, my contact information is in the last slide. You guys have been wonderful, and maybe I'll see some of you tomorrow. So thank you so much.